This week marks 1 year since New Zealand went into level 4 lockdown. We, I believe, met the crisis of a global pandemic head on. We went hard and early, and we succeeded in doing what we set out to do, which was to eliminate the virus. That was 2020, one of the most challenging years we had faced as a country. 1 year on, New Zealand's overall COVID strategy remains the same: elimination. But how we eliminate is shifting. The vaccine is allowing us to move our COVID defences away from what has essentially been a collective barricade in the form of border controls, managed quarantine facilities and isolation, to individual armour that we each can carry around with us in the form of a vaccine. We intend to vaccinate everyone who can be vaccinated before the end of 2021 because this offers the same safety of an elimination strategy but with far greater freedoms and less risk. As a result of the vaccine, 2021 is the year when possibilities begin to open up, when we get to lock in the gains that everyone worked so hard for in 2020. A key opportunity that has arisen as a result of our strategy is quarantine-free travel with Australia. There's been much speculation over this. Our position has always been clear. Opening up our borders to our nearest neighbour is a priority, not only for tourism and business, but also in terms of reuniting friends and families. We know what it would mean for people. But we also know that many New Zealanders are nervous. They don't want to put everything we've fought so hard for at risk, and they want us to proceed with the same vein as our overall COVID response, and that is with caution. We also know people want certainty. They want certainty about what lies ahead, certainty to make plans, certainty about what the future looks like. What we haven't wanted to do is enter a situation in which New Zealanders' health or lives are at risk once more, or we were unable to offer that certainty. It goes without saying that opening up a green travel zone with Australia without quarantine is highly complex. Officials have been considering and working through these complexities for months. Cabinet today received an update on this work. But before any final decision is made by Cabinet, we'll need to be satisfied that the following conditions have been met. 1, that our response framework for when there are cases in Australia is fit for purpose and ready. 2, we have measures in place to effectively contact trace travellers from Australia should we need to. 3, all technical issues are resolved, including transiting passengers and managed isolation fees when, for instance, passengers arrive in either Australia or New Zealand, but their ultimate destination is different. 4, that we have the appropriate regulatory mechanisms in place. 5, that airlines, airports and agencies are ready. Much work has already been done here with issues like crew separation from high-risk areas and for when they would fly in a quarantine zone, and red and green zones at our airports. Much work has been done there given we already have quarantine-free travel inward from the likes of the Cook Islands. And finally, that the Director-General of Health has provided an up-to-date health assessment. Once we've met these criteria, we anticipate we'll be in a position to open the bubble. We understand the need for planning and certainty, and talks with airlines and airports has been ongoing. We intend to announce the commencement date for the Transtasman travel bubble on the 6th of April. So just to be clear, we intend to announce the commencement date for Trans-Tasman travel on the 6th of April. Before I open up for questions, I'd like to take a moment to touch on another government priority, and that's housing. Tomorrow, Ministers Robertson, Woods, Parker and myself will be setting out a plan and package to tilt the balance towards first home buyers and increase housing supply. Our government inherited a housing crisis, the problems and challenges of which have been well canvassed, decades of failure to invest, increasing numbers of speculators in the market, unsustainable house price growth locking out first home buyers, soaring rent levels and restrictive planning rules. Property investors now make up the biggest share of buyers in the market. Meanwhile, house prices are rising much faster than wages, so homes continue to climb out of reach for many first home buyers, and the New Zealand housing market has become the least affordable in the OECD. It will take time to turn all this around, and unfortunately, there is no silver bullet. But there are things we can do. We have been getting on with this already, things like reforming the RMA, compelling local councils to free up land through the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, working with the Reserve Bank to take some demand out of the market, and undertaking the biggest public housing build program since the 1970s. But we believe there is more we can do. And tomorrow morning we'll outline a suite of both urgent and longer-term measures. The package will include steps to increase the supply of houses and improve affordability for home buyers and renters. It will aim to tip the balance away from property investors and towards first home buyers and curb rampant speculation. It is, I believe, a plan that will start to make a real difference to this complex problem. And I look forward to sharing it with you all tomorrow here on this same podium. But for now, open for questions. Jessica.
Prime Minister, you talk about giving people certainty. Why not announce a date for the Oz bubble today then?
Because we don't have a date for you. You know, I've set out today the things that we are making sure that are ready to go. And on the 6th of April, we'll then be sharing the date for the opening of the Transtasman arrangement. What I want to do, though, is make sure that when we do that, we know we're ready, that we have a plan in place if in the near term we have an outbreak, and we almost certainly, on either side of the Tasman, will have to deal with scenarios like that. We've got to make sure we have a plan in place to deal with the number of people who could either be in New Zealand or Australia at that time. Jessica.
You've had a year already, though.
Yep, and in that time, on at least 12 occasions, we've met as New Zealand and Australia teams together to work through a New Zealand and Australia arrangement. That would have meant that we'd be working together on decision makings around when we would shut down the borders or when we might have to cease travel if we had outbreaks. Since that time, obviously, states have opened up. The majority have not. They still remain closed. Our view is, rather than trying to work through a solution that sees all of Australia with New Zealand, that we can work through an arrangement that sees us operating with some states but not others.
Why are we still in a place that you're still having to go through?
Sorry, can you start the question?
Why are we still in a place where you're still having to check off some of these things, like getting the airports ready, getting the airlines ready?
Look,
why isn't that working?
Well, actually, no. To be fair to both the airlines and the airports, a significant amount of work has already been done in those areas. What, of course, is different than what we've been planning through the entire time is we now will have to deal with different circumstances in different states, which does add complexity, but it is not insurmountable. What I would say is that there's no other countries in the world who have been working to an elimination strategy who are now trying to maintain that whilst opening up travel between the two. So we are having to create a brand new rule book. Now, we've done that before and we're doing it again here, but it does come with complexity, particularly for New Zealand, more so than for Australia.
That state-by-state approach is not new. Your former deputy back in April last year was both publicly and with his counterpart talking about how it would be easier to work at a state-by-state level than trying to work with the whole country. So why has it taken until now for the government to catch up and actually be having those conversations?
We never, as both, at that time, we were still working on a country-by-country, two-country arrangement because it quite simply was easier. If you think about it from New Zealand's perspective, we're now having to deal with a situation where if you have an outbreak in one state, how you'll then manage travel in surrounding and potentially bordering states in the eventuality that, for instance, they may not close down border travel between the two. It's much more complex for New Zealand than it is for Australia. So we'd always been working country to country. In fact, even after they opened up as states, we were still working on that basis. Our view has been it would be faster if we try and formulate a different arrangement. The last thing I would say is that this change in approach isn't without risk for travellers. We may have scenarios where travel will shut down one way, and it may therefore leave travellers for a period of time stranded on either side of the Tasman. That's one of the downsides of moving through this arrangement, but it does mean that we can find a solution and open up more quickly. I'll come to you, Jane. We've got time, everyone. Jane.
Was there a separate paper on Niue and Cook Islands, and could there be a separate announcement on that in terms of timing?
So we of course have separate one-way inward travel arrangements for Niue and the Cook Islands. The question has been around return quarantine-free travel going in country. So they're already coming here without quarantine. The question is what happens to New Zealanders going into the Cook Islands and Niue. Obviously, Niue and the Cook Islands haven't taken the same approach on timelines. One has been a little more willing to wait a little longer than the other. But what I think I'll do is just wait until we've got PM Brown in country on Friday to talk a little more detail around that.
Bring it up from the New Zealand side in terms of a full safe travel kind of bubble, as it were, between those countries.
Yeah, I'm going to leave
some.
some. Yeah, I'm going to actually leave some of that because it's not just, of course, what's happening on the New Zealand side. It's ultimately also what's happening on the Cook Islands side as well. So I think probably I'd prefer to speak to that in more detail with Prime Minister Brown with me on Friday.
Different time frame to that of the Trans-Tasman bubble?
We've never said that they necessarily will be linked or on the same time frame. No, so they don't necessarily have to be connected.
So what makes you think, or what is going to change between now and April the 6th that will allow you to tick all the boxes?
Work on contact tracing requirements, use of the QR codes, any arrangements around testing that may or may not be required, the final framework for alert, basically essentially an alert level system that takes into account multiple states. What can people expect? On what basis would New Zealand shut down if we had or saw cases offshore? We want to provide a little transparency around that and just making sure that we've got that final readiness in place. What are our expectations of all airlines operating in New Zealand, not just Air New Zealand, around crew separation and so on? So there are layers to this, not all of which I'll bore you with now, but it does have a significant layer of complexity, but we feel confident we can announce a date from the 6th.
Henry. If all those criteria are met, which I think some people would argue they are already being met. If all those criteria are met on April 6th, how long will it be between that date and the actual announcement? Are you talking weeks or months?
That would essentially, if I did that, I would be announcing a date, wouldn't I? So what we've set out are the things that we expect that we need to have, even if they haven't been met, a plan or some certainty around the date on which they'll be delivered, and then we'll be sharing that with you. But I have always said I expect the opening to be soon. So we feel confident enough about where we are now to announce the commencement date on the 6th of April.
Do you think?
Yeah, Ben.
I'll let Henry follow. Do you envision the safe travel advice changing? It's currently that Kiwis should not leave New Zealand under any circumstances.
Yeah, so
do you think when there is a safe travel
yeah,
advice,
I mean, look, obviously that would need to be updated, and you'd expect that as part of the work that we're doing. Equally, Australia, and keep in mind, we've operated differently here. Kiwis have continued to travel through this period. Obviously, they're required to quarantine on return, but they have been able to leave the country. In Australia, you have to get a visa. You have to get permission to leave the country. And so they'll have things on their side that they've worked through as well, and I imagine that includes their safe travel guidance too.
And that's a nice segue into my question, because it's been reported that the exit visa has been removed by the Australian government. Did you ask for that?
Look, it's obvious that as part of these arrangements that would need to be amended, so that has been part of our talks, and so all of this will be in preparation.
Now have you cleared off the issues with the Australian government and now you can focus directly on chatting to states, or how does that work?
So we have continued talks at a federal level because on some occasions some of these decisions, the decisions are being made at that level. So we will, of course, keep up those discussions around how we expect to operate, what communication we'll have if we're making a decision, because at the moment, of course, they tell us when they're going to shut down and they tell us when they're going to open up. So we'll be keeping up the conversations with them about how we anticipate operating. One of the issues will be that it won't always be in parallel. So that's the issue that for all of the view that this is a simple thing to deliver, we will see the complexity when we see singular decisions made on one side that could lead to people being stranded. Jessica, and then I'll come to you, Jenna.
If someone travels to Australia, how much warning will they get before the borders close, if any, and what responsibility will the government take for getting them back? And
this is one of the reasons why Cabinet is working through in a lot of detail the complexity around an arrangement like this, because as you will have already seen from Australia, often there is very little notice when travel ceases, and we will have to operate on the same basis. If we want to maintain a situation where New Zealand does not have COVID in the country, if there is an outbreak identified in Australia, and, for instance, are not aware of the source, it is very likely that you would see us close down travel for a period of time until we can be confident of what is occurring. It's not too dissimilar to exactly what we do with our alert level framework.
So they're on their own, effectively. If you choose to go over, you have to take that responsibility.
This, because as much as, of course, we will want to be inviting Australians to come into New Zealand, and I'm sure likewise they'll be wanting to do the same for Kiwis. I think on both sides of the ditch, we will be saying to make this work, there will be an element of flyer beware. We want to keep this open, we want to keep it moving, but we also want to keep both sides safe. So there may be occasions when we take a precautionary approach and for short periods of time travel ceases.
They'd be on the hook for MIQ fees as well.
And so these are some of the things that we're working through as well. If you had a significant outbreak versus something that's smaller and isolated, would we require at-home isolation, or would there be an occasion where MIQ would be utilised? So you can see the complexity here. We would never have enough MIQ to accommodate everyone who could potentially be in Australia or returning from a particular zone at any given time. Thousands travel between New Zealand and Australia. So these are some of the more complex issues we're having to work through.
Do you agree that, with Damien O'Connor, that COVID-19 has taught the tourism sector to be less cocky?
Oh, look, obviously Damien will take his view. He lives and works across a particular region that has been hard hit. My view would be that we have all wanted to see the tourism industry back on its feet. But equally, we've also heard them tell us that they want us to keep domestic tourism nice and strong as well. So we're trying to strike that balance around getting our domestic population moving, but making sure we don't put that at risk by adding too early, before we've got the safeguards in place, another travel zone.
So you don't agree with the assessment of the industry?
I wouldn't express it in that way. I think that industry by and large accepts that we've done what we can, where we've been able to, but I know it hasn't always been enough from their perspective.
This is the second time that his
Sorry, I was going to come to Mikey, but
this is the second time that his comments have been, strong comments you haven't necessarily agreed with. I mean, is he off message here? Is he out of line?
Oh, look, I won't always express things in the same way as my ministers. I expect that will be the case. We're all different people.
Prime Minister, what do you think of the SIS releasing its internal report into the lead up to the March 15 attacks, and how confident are you the changes it recommends have been enacted?
Well, I am confident that, of course, for instance, from the Royal Commission, that we are working through quite a wide-ranging program of work, some of which we'd already started work on. So, for instance, they advised that we needed to address the issue that there weren't offences around the preparation of potential terrorist activity. We'd already started work there, but they've also suggested wider reviews be undertaken, and we are kicking that off as well.
How much safer are we now from domestic terror threats?
So I think you've seen in the analysis of our landscape a bit of a consistency since the aftermath. We know, and we know this because, unfortunately, of our experience, that we are not immune to threats of domestic terror in New Zealand. What we've got to do is make sure we continually prepare ourselves the best we can.
Will you be extending the bright line
Jenna,
test?
sorry, I forgot that.
Will you be extending the bright line test?
Oh, I'm not going to be making any announcements relevant to housing until tomorrow. Yes, I haven't taken you, Bernard, and then I'll come back round to you, Justin, and then Joe. Yeah.
On MIQ, Prime Minister, would an Australian bubble free up space within MIQ for more people to come from other parts of the world, or will that be set aside as a contingency? Yeah. So I got asked about this last week, and actually it was, I think, worth reflecting on the point that Michael Baker has made, which is you're freeing up in a bit of capacity in MIQ, but you run the risk of heightening the risk profile for New Zealand by taking what has been low risk or lower risk individuals and replacing them with those coming from higher risk countries. But actually what we're really having to build into our thinking is, with that capacity, to what extent would it be required for emergency situations in managing the bubble or not? And so those are some of the things Cabinet's working through. What I expect is that at the time that we make announcements around the Transtasman bubble, we will also give an indication of how we expect
MIQ capacity to be used.
So it's possible that it might not increase much at all?
Look, that's one of the areas where Cabinet is working through how that would be utilised and how it would be apportioned. But we are factoring in some of those issues that are being raised by our experts in the field. Justin.
In terms of possible kind of snap closures of the bubble, without a binational kind of body dealing with this, that could happen. Are you expecting that there's going to be a need for some better communications or notification framework for the states to New Zealand in terms of actually, shutdown?
I think to be fair, it's actually, I think, improved quite a bit since we had the one-way travel announced. You know, we've become very aware of how important it is to have really timely information flowing to Australia because they are making these significant decisions. My view is that will only continue to be of incredible importance to both sides. Because previously, Australia's decision were affecting predominantly Kiwis. Those decisions now will affect Australians in New Zealand too. So it's in both our best interest to make sure that we're communicating well, and my view is that we actually are.
Well, the New Zealand
our health officials talk directly to one another.
Will the New Zealand government find itself in a position where it's actually going to have to start telling New Zealanders about shutdowns in Australia rather than waiting for the 6 o'clock news?
We will have to, sorry, run that with me.
Will you have to communicate it yourself that Victoria is shutting down instead of what's currently happening where it's mostly shared through the news?
On the Victoria side, for instance. Oh, well, look, you know, we would want to make sure that we were making decisions in a timely way. So if we had information that meant we'd met really the threshold where we would want to take a pause, then we would want to move on that very quickly. Yeah.
Jo. Going back to your comment earlier where you said working with Australia as a whole country would be easier than on a state-by-state basis.
Yeah, by and large.
Can you kind of explain the logic behind that? Because as it stands at the moment, state premiers are making state-by-state decisions. They're shutting borders, opening borders and doing that amongst themselves.
Yes.
So having New Zealand as kind of effectively another state in the mix, wouldn't that be a better system because you've already got a state-by-state system operating?
Oh, a better system from the perspective potentially of, you know, getting early access. Yes. A better system from the perspective of New Zealand now having to integrate itself into some of those mechanisms. It does make it tricky because, of course, if you have, for instance, a case or a series of cases or an outbreak indeed in New South Wales, for instance, you may choose then to say, well, we need to take a closure there. How then do you deal with travellers who might be coming through from Queensland if they don't close the domestic border between the two? They may, but they may not. So then are you closing down to Queensland as well? These are all issues that we need to make sure that we're factoring into the way that we'll work, giving as much transparency around how we'll make those decisions and what travellers can expect.
My point is that those circumstances would exist under a whole of country model anyway.
We had previously been trying to negotiate a framework that would mean that we had some consistency around the way we were dealing with Australia as a whole. But now those are decisions that we're going to have to individually take on how we're dealing with travel coming in and out of individual states. I haven't taken you.
Minister Hipkins has previously said that Cabinet can't mandate use of the scanning component of the NZ COVID tracer app because Apple and Google will pull their support for the Bluetooth component. Is that your understanding? And is your are there any concerns raised by a potential attempt to mandate scanning by Australian visitors?
Yeah, I don't have that level of detail around what it would do for, from a licensing perspective. I unfortunately cannot answer that question. But what we are thinking about is, what will be really important to us is that when we've got that extra complexity of someone who's travelling in from overseas, where our finding services may not be as good, of course, because we don't have as much information about someone who is a non-citizen or resident, what can we do to enhance our ability to make sure that we can contact people successfully? So that's some of the things we're working through.
Will the government formally apologise?
Oh, sorry, Jane.
Will the government formally apologise for the dawn raids?
I understand an approach has been made or perhaps correspondence received. I've only just been advised of that, so I want to take the time to receive that properly, look at the request that's being made and come back to you officially if I can. Sorry, I've only just been made aware of that. I'll go Jason and then just...
How much did the pressure from the likes of Scott Morrison on the New Zealand not having a travel bubble play into your decision?
Not at all. We've always made our own decisions on our own terms based on our strategy. And as I've said a couple of times this morning, I think there's a bit of a view that this work hadn't been underway. We had met between New Zealand and Australia 12 times trying to work through some of the complexity, and we are seeing that bear fruit now. None of this has been done just in the last week. This work has been underway for quite some time.
Why is there only,
and then I'll come to you, Thomas.
Why is there only one white supremacist or far-right terror entity on the national terror list?
So that's our terrorist designation list. And I think the easiest way for me to explain why that is by sharing with you the designation criteria, which reads that the entity has knowingly carried out or has knowingly participated in an attempt to conduct one or more terrorist acts. And so there's a certain degree to which actually activity and particularly international designation plays into our system. It does, however, not mean that that is the only way that you become an entity or individual of concern to our authorities. That is not true. That is, however, one mechanism where we stop the financial flow and the financing of terrorist activity into these organised groups.
Some security experts, though, would like to see you use that list as a way to, I guess, curb those groups and to stop the financial flow going into them. So could you, change it? Change the way
and so in order for the
so
financial flows to be stopped, it does by default require there to be a level of organisation, even if it is relatively sophisticated, and for the entity to be identified and designated. You can see the criteria is quite specific around what's required to meet that threshold. But again, no one should for a moment think that if you are not on our designation list, that you are not an entity or individual of concern. That is not true. It is just one of our mechanisms for where we identify people of concern.
Is that criteria too restrictive, though? Should it change?
It is tightly defined, but that's because by default it then needs to be the existence of an organised entity. And that's one of the ways that we do that. My understanding, but I will check this, is that our designation is fairly similar to other countries in the way that we work. Also, of course, if a group is designated by an international body, the UN, we don't replicate it in our domestic legislation necessarily. Sorry, Thomas, I did say I'd come to you, and then I'll come to you, Richard.
A couple of weeks ago, Jenny Anderson said she only understood the full mechanics of her unique electorate rental agreement in the latter half of 2020. She now says she sort of understood that since 2017 onwards. Are you happy that she's told the full truth throughout this time about her unique rental deal?
Yeah, look, what I'm concerned about is making sure that our MPs are meeting the rules that apply to them, and be it through the Electoral Commission or through parliamentary services. Of course, as you're aware, the arrangement that has existed there historically has now changed as of the election. It's not unusual that would happen when lease arrangements come up, and it's not unusual for MPs to inherit arrangements that they subsequently change.
Do you think she should have been more forthcoming with the truth when she was asked about it, though?
Ultimately, all of our arrangements, if they're being checked by parliamentary services and the Electoral Commission, are being examined by others and by the entities that really have a role in making sure that what should be happening on behalf of taxpayers is.
The Auckland Sky Path is going
and then
to
I'll come to you, Ben. Yep.
Now that we know the Auckland Sky Path is going to be delayed, how much longer will people have to wait to be able to walk or bike over the harbour bridge?
We all want to see Auckland connected, and the ability for people to be able to move across from the shore over into central Auckland by walking and cycling. The issue that we've encountered is, since we've, of course, had, the recent engineering fallout from the accident on the harbour bridge, that has posed some challenges. What we need to do is make sure that when we set up that ability to move between the two, we do it safely.
Is a completely different structure needed given all of those engineering problems?
And that's a question that I think we're rightly asking Waka Kotahi. What's it going to take to make this happen? Is it still feasible and viable to do it through the original plans? Do we need to think of other options? Ultimately, though, that goal that we have to build that connection by walking and cycling so that you're not you're not confined by car across the harbour bridge. We all still share that. We're all still working towards that.
8 lanes for cars right now. Couldn't one of them be given over to cyclists in the meantime?
That's not a question I've ever asked, but I think what we would want is for the option to be sustainable in the long term. We know that there are capacity constraints, and I wouldn't want to actually unnecessarily set up this friction between the two when what we want is multimodal transport.
Only half of the Australian states are open to New Zealand passengers without travellers without
Thank you for
quarantine.
highlighting that.
No worries. When New Zealand opens for Australian travellers, am I getting this the right way around?
Yes.
I'm confused.
Yes.
Thank you. Will you only be opening to those 3 Australian states, or will it be open to whichever states choose to take up your offer?
Yeah, and so we would be looking to make sure that, you know, those that we deem to be safe, we would be open to, unless there were an issue in any particular state in which you would close. Of course, the most obvious factor for us is where there is currently the ability to move between the two. And that's not the case everywhere.
So the reciprocal.
Yeah, so for us it would be, if it's safe, then we'd be opening up even regardless of whether or not you actually had the ability to travel between the two or not.
You've previously had 2 different time frames for opening the bubble, and you've walked away from those for different reasons. Can you give an absolute guarantee that the
I had to, have I? We gave the general first quarter suggestion.
You also said it to Papa last year that September was realistic, but then the Melbourne bubble quashed that because you were
Yes,
a
it
national
did.
approach. So
you'd forgive us that one then, obviously.
You know, sure. Will you give an absolute guarantee that the date you nominate on April 6th will be the
And
date
that's why that is why we'll be announcing it on the 6th of April, because I want at that time that we give that date, I want it to be something we can stick to. Keep in mind that it will be the case with this opening that if at any given time there is an outbreak, we will have a closure, because that's how we maintain freedom. Richard, sorry.
Yeah, what would happen if either Australia or New Zealand unilaterally opened to a third country?
Oh, then we would of course, you know, review our settings. So look at whether or not it changed up the risk profile at all. And that was another thing that we were working through country by country, Joe, when we were working at that level. Then we were talking about how would we deal with third country entry into a bubble. But we'll now have to just deal with that separately as it arises.
Other than Australia and the Pacific Islands and the realm country, who has approached New Zealand looking to set up?
Oh, look, there's been a number, some of them actually were very, very early on, and they were more caveated. If at some point we're able to open up, let's keep up talks. And so obviously Fiji has been interested for some time, and you've already heard the suggestion from Singapore.
Taiwan, any movement there?
Oh, I would need to go back and see whether or not that was officially raised. Forgive me, Henry.
How much of a factor is the vaccination
and then I'll come to you, Mark, and then I might wrap if that's okay.
How much of a factor is the vaccination of both countries' border workers? Because once they're all vaccinated, the risk of an outbreak from MIQ is much, much lower.
Well, it is lessened. Absolutely, it is lessened. But no, that actually hasn't factored into our thinking. You know, obviously we've been working on this since before the vaccine started rolling out. So no, it's an added benefit, but it's not contingent. Our opening is not contingent on that being completed.
On the designated terrorist entities list,
Yeah.
there are far-right groups that are organised and have knowingly committed terror attacks. Canada, for example, has designated...
Had the Proud Boys, didn't they?
Yeah, the Proud Boys, the Base, Adam Waffen Division. Is there any... Would you like to take another look at that?
And I don't, to be fair, I'm just not au fait enough with the process that Canada uses in order to designate. But international activity can be used international activity can be used to meet our criteria. But again, as I've said, the entity has knowingly carried out or has knowingly participated in an attempt to conduct one or more terrorist acts. Again, though, we do keep this under rolling review, and not for a moment should anyone look at that list and say that that is the full scope of what New Zealand considers to be a group of risk or concern or violence. Okay, thank you, everyone.